Hello everyone. In this lesson, we will learn how to set up a menu of children page links for the current page that you are viewing. So for example, if I navigate to our About Us page, we know that this page has two children pages named Our History and Our Goals, but we don't see links to those anywhere. So our goal for this lesson is to add a menu right about here that has links to the applicable children pages. If you think back to several lessons ago, you will remember that we actually commented out that menu. So over in your text editor, within your theme folder, jump into page.php, and if you scroll down about halfway or a little bit further, remember this div that we commented out. So at this point, we can just remove these comments and then remove this closing comment down here. Okay, so we've got this div with a class of page links. And if I save this and refresh the page, here's the menu that I'm referring to, but right now it's hard-coded, which means it's not dynamic. What I mean is the hard-coded data of About Us, Our History, and Our Goals only makes sense because that's a contrived example. But if we scroll down to the footer and click on the privacy policy page, now it becomes painfully obvious that the menu is not dynamic. Right? Instead of About Us, this should say Privacy Policy, which is the current parent page. And then down here, we should see links to any Privacy Policy children pages. So right now, let's begin writing the code to make this menu dynamic. Let's focus on this list of children links first, and then after that, we'll work on this parent page header link. So back in the code, here is the unordered list of links, right? There's a list item for each link. So we don't want these list items to be hard-coded, so let's just delete these. So now we have an empty UL element, and within that element, let's drop into PHP, and let's call a WordPress function named WP list pages. Now, before we even worry about providing any arguments inside the parentheses, let's just save this and see what it does. So that function created links to every single page on our website, which is obviously not what we want. We only want children pages of the current page being viewed. Also, up here, we can see that this function outputs this odd little title named pages. And we don't want this. So the question becomes, how do we tell this function WP list pages to do what we want it to do? Well, obviously that's the job of arguments that we can pass it within the parentheses. However, this function needs us to provide it arguments in a very specific format. So for example, we can't just include one argument and then a comma and then another argument. Instead, this function wants us to pass it an array. And not just any array, it needs an associative array. So right now, let's take a quick time out and forget about this function and instead answer the question, what in the world is an associative array? So several lessons ago, we saw an example of a very basic array. So to refresh your memory, let me create a very basic array. Maybe I'll create a variable named animals and set it to equal an array. So then within that array, I can say cat, comma, dog, comma, pig. So an array lets us have multiple pieces of data that live within a larger collection. However, what if I wanted to associate a value with each animal? So for example, what if I wanted to list the sound that each animal makes? So for cat, it would be meow, for dog, it would be bark, and for pig, it would be oink. Well, in order to do that, I would need to create an associative array. So check this out. Let me delete this line, and let's imagine I want to create a variable named animal sounds. And I set it to equal an array, and then within the array, the first item is cat, and then right after cat, I say equal symbol greater than meow, and then include a comma and do the same thing for dog. Now, I could list all the items on a single line, but when I'm working with associative arrays, just to stay organized, I like to put each one on its own line. So we've got cat equals meow, then comma, dog equal symbol greater than, dog equals bark, comma, pig equals oink. And this is an example of an associative array. We've associated a value with each item. And now, maybe later on in my code, if I want to access the sound that a dog makes, and maybe I want to echo it out onto the page, I can just say echo, look inside my variable, so echo animal sounds. And then to look inside an array, you use square brackets. And then instead of looking for a zero-based numerical key, since we are working with an associative array, we can just reference this label or key name. So within the square brackets, I could just say dog, and be sure to end that line with a semicolon. And if we save and refresh, there we see the value of bark. Cool. So now that we are at least a little bit familiar with an associative array, let's get back to the task at hand, which is working with this WP list pages function. So let me delete this example code. And now let's get down to business of providing this function with an associative array that tells it exactly what we want it to do. So within the parentheses, let's say array, and then give the word array its own pair of parentheses, right? This is how you create an array in PHP. Now we could begin typing here, but just to stay organized, I like to drop down in between these array parentheses onto a new line. And the first thing I want to do is tell the function that it doesn't need to output this odd little pages title. So if we don't want that title, this function has a parameter named title underscore li for list item, and we can just set that to equal null. So just like earlier when we said cat equals meow or dog equals bark, we are saying the title equals empty or nothing. So if we save that and refresh, cool, that awkward title went away. Now we just need to tell the function that we don't want every single page on our website. We only want links to children pages of the current page. So back in our code, let's add a comma at the end of this line so we can add another item to the array. And this function has a parameter named child underscore of, and we just want to set that to equal the numerical ID of a certain page or post. Now before we make this dynamic, let's hard code a number just to see how it works. So for example, if I want children pages of the privacy policy page, I can find the numerical ID of the privacy policy page by going into my admin dashboard, looking under pages, and if I click on that privacy policy page to begin editing it, up in the URL address bar, I can see it has an ID of 18. So back in the code, if I say child of equals 18, save it and refresh, cool, there we see cookie policy, which is the only child page of privacy policy. And if I use this link in the header to visit the About Us page, if we want to display the two About Us child pages, we could just go into our admin dashboard, find the ID for About Us, which is 16. So if I say child of equals 16, cool, we see the applicable child pages. Now obviously, we don't really want to hard code a number here. We want this menu to be dynamic, right? Because if I go back to the privacy policy page, it should just automatically pull in the correct current child pages. So in order to make this dynamic, your first instinct might be to get rid of the hard-coded number and use the WordPress function get the ID, right? This will return the ID of the current page. So let's try that. So that works perfectly when you are on a parent page, but once we click on to the cookie policy child page, now that section is completely blank. And that's because once we are on a child page, now our code is going to try to use that child ID and try to find children of it. And that's not what we want. So we need to provide a different ID number here depending on the situation. If we are on a parent page, we can indeed go ahead and just use the ID of the current page. But if we are on a child page, we can't just use the current ID. We need to actively look up the parent page ID. So here's how I would handle things. Up above this function, so right when we're getting into PHP here, I would just create an if statement. So the word if, parentheses, and then curly brackets. And for my condition within the parentheses, I would say if the variable named the parent, remember we set up that variable in our previous lesson. We created a variable named the parent, and it will equal the ID of the current page's parent page, or if the current page is a parent, it will just equal 0. Okay, so let's leverage that variable again down here. So this code is saying only if that the parent variable does not equal 0, only if that's the case, run the code within these curly brackets. Or in plain English, only if the current page has a parent, do something. So let's just create a brand new variable and call it find children of. The name doesn't matter, I'm just making up this name. But if you're currently on a child page, let's set this to equal the parent ID. Okay, and what if this evaluates to false? So if you're viewing a parent page, this will be 0, which will evaluate to false. So this code will not run. And then what we can do is right after this curly bracket, we can say else, and then open up a new pair of curly brackets. And this will only run if this is false. So if this is the case, do this. Otherwise, else, do whatever we say here. In this case, let's assign our find children of, our made up variable. In that case, we can go ahead and get the current ID of whatever page you're viewing. So get the ID. Cool, so now we've taken care of that conditional logic. Now down here, when we are actually calling the important WP list pages function, we can just say child of equals, and we can reference this variable of ours that we just made up. So find children of. So let's go ahead and save that and refresh. Perfect. So now, even though I'm on a child page of cookie policy, we still see links to children pages of the current section. So if I go up in the header and click on About Us, we see the two subpages, and even if I click on to Our History, we still have the relevant child links. Okay, now at this point, let's change gears and work on this blue header link that should always point back to the current section's parent page. So back in our code, here's that blue headline link, and we don't want it to be hard-coded to About Us. So first, let's make the title dynamic, and then let's make the href link value dynamic. So delete About Us and drop into PHP. And then let's echo out the results of a WordPress function, get the title. And within the parentheses, we can just pass an argument of our the parent variable. This will work really nicely with this function because if this returns a 0, which means the current page is a parent page, this getTheTitle function interprets a 0 as meaning the current page. Cool, now let's do something very similar for the href value. Delete the hashtag, drop into PHP, and let's echo out the results of getPermalink. And within the parentheses, just pass it an argument of our the parent variable. Cool, so let's save that and refresh. So we're currently on the Our History child page, but if I click this blue headline, it takes me to the parent page. And if I go down into the footer and click on Privacy Policy, I can click on this to navigate to a child page, and we can always use this header link to go back to the parent page. Okay, so at this point, we've made the menu dynamic, but now we need to ask ourselves, what happens if we go to a page that isn't a child page, but also isn't a parent page because it doesn't have any children of its own? So for example, to show you what I'm talking about, up in the address bar, if I visit my sample page named test page 123, this page doesn't belong to any other pages, but it also doesn't have any of its own children. So in this case, we probably just don't want to display this side menu at all, right? So we wouldn't even want this blue headline to appear. So back in our code, what I recommend doing is wrapping this page links div, just wrapping that entire thing within a PHP if statement. So right before this begins, let's drop into PHP and say only if, parentheses, curly bracket, but let's only use the opening curly bracket and then drop out of PHP. So then we can have all of this HTML, and then right when that div is going to end, right after that, we can drop into PHP, close out the curly bracket for the if statement, and then close out of PHP. So now all we need to do is fill out the if statement's condition within these parentheses. So we only want to display this menu if you are currently on a child page. So to check for that, we can just use our the parent variable, right? Because on a child page, this variable will equal a number larger than 0. So this will evaluate to true. And then right after that, we can say, or we also want to display this menu if you're on a parent page. So the or operator here is very powerful. It lets us have multiple conditions, and if either one of them evaluates to true, then this will run. Now, believe it or not, in WordPress, there is no easy way to see if the page is a parent. But there is a slightly roundabout, tricky way of doing it. So here's what I would do. Let's add a line right above this current line that we're on. Okay, and let's create a variable. We could name it whatever we want. I will call it test array. And let's set it to equal the results of a WordPress function named get_pages. This getPages function is very similar to WP list pages. Really, the only difference is that this function will handle outputting the pages onto the screen for you, whereas this function just returns the pages in memory. So if this function is almost identical to this function, that means we want to pass it an array of arguments. So within these parentheses, let's say array, and then I like to drop down just to stay organized. And the only parameter we need to use here is child of equals, and let's just use the ID of the current page, so get the ID. And now if the current page has children, this function will return a collection of any and all children pages. On the other hand, if the current page doesn't have any children, this function won't return anything. It will return null or false or 0. And as we know, within an if statement, if something is 0 or empty, it will evaluate to false. So if the current page has a parent, or if it is a parent, all we need to do to check for that is just type out our variable name, test array. So or test array. Cool, so let's save this and refresh this test page, which is neither a child page or a parent page. And hopefully this menu should disappear completely. Cool, but if we go back to the About Us page, the menu's back in business. We can go to a child page. We can go to the privacy policy page. Things are looking good. Now, before we bring this lesson to a close, I have one last tip for you. If I go back to the About Us page, you'll notice that I have multiple children links. And you might be wondering, how can you control the ordering of these? For example, what if I wanted our history to come before our goals? By default, WordPress will use alphabetical ordering, but if you want to use your own custom ordering, all you need to do, down here when we are calling this list pages function, within our array of arguments, let's just add another item, and let's use a parameter named sort column and set it to equal menu_order. Now, if we save this and then jump into our WordPress admin screen, if I jump into the page that I want to be first, our history, over in the right-hand column in this page attributes area, you'll see an order box. Now, if I give that page an order of 1, and then go give the other Our Goals page an order of 2, well, those order values will determine which goes first. And that's going to bring this lesson to a close. That means we're done with relatively boring pages, and now we can move on to dynamic navigation menus and building out our blog. And after that, we'll get into the truly fun stuff, probably the reason you signed up for the course in the first place, which is learning about custom post types, custom fields, creating relationships, and pulling in information dynamically with JavaScript. We've come a long way, but we still have tons to learn. Let's keep it rolling. I'll see you in the next one.